Good morning again, and I will welcome you to our first seminar for the series Bias for Business, the seminar. Today is August 10, 2020, and this seminar is sponsored by Perspectivas Globales. Today I will be your moderator. I am Dr. Beatriz Lopez, everybody call me Dr. B, and I will be with you on Perspectivas Globales for the next 3 days, exploring what? We are exploring biases as a key for the success of your business, applying strategies, models, and how to manage and create new ones. Who is Dr. B? Dr. B is from Aguada, Puerto Rico. I completed my high school in Aguadilla at Colegio San Carlos. I'm a biology educator, I'm an entrepreneur, a startup mentor, but passionate about professional learning communities, how to put together university, school, enterprises, everybody to work for one role, move on the world. During this preparation, I learned with the team how we respond to different environments and how we respond according to our perspective. What are we talking today? Today, we're going to be talking about the origin of biases. And we're going to have two special speakers, Dr. Jose Melendez and Shaliana Rolon. Dr. Jose Melendez is from Moca, Puerto Rico. He finished his high school in California at Travis Air Force Base at Bandon High School. He graduated from 2 Ivy schools, pursuing his computer science engineer degree, but also he had a concentration in psychology. 10 years ago, Dr. Melendez founded Spectral MD, together with two co-founders, Dr. Michael DeMayo, a cardiothoracic surgeon, and the Institution of Texas University, well known as UT. The company developed his invention to provide advanced image using artificial intelligence for the use of healthcare. Since the beginning of that company, $150 million contracts were specialized with the United States Biomedical Advanced Research in the benefit of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. 10 years later, Dr. Melendez is paying it forward, very happy and excited to be teaching and doing research and diverse activities at the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez, my alma mater also. His investments in Puerto Rico and other communities around the United States are supporting as a whole the island and other countries. Dr. Melendez often asks how to start a successful, what is the secret of successful technology-based company from scratch, and how go from scratch to enjoy and get $100 million in success. But in his perspective and his view, there's not a secret, it's only one skill. And the skill is that you need to understand and manage actively your biases, the biases that works for you, and be aware of the biases of others. On the other hand, our second speaker, Shaliana Rolon. Shaliana Rolon is from Bayamón, Puerto Rico. She went to school in University Gardens High School, located in San Juan. For me, one of the best schools in metro area. Actually, she's a computer science and software engineer student at Mayagüez University, University of Puerto Rico, that we call Colegio. During the preparation of this seminar, she had changed her perspective in a way that as a professional and as a person, she thinks about what people do and think, but she also, as a future software developer, an engineer in software, she think about how can she develop great experience through artificial intelligence and software engineering. For today, that we're going to talk about the reading of biases and identifying definitions with a great model that was designed by one of the members of the team. I will encourage you to have basic tools, pens, pencils, or advanced tools like your phone, or any other way that you like to take your notes. Also, if you have any questions or comments during this seminar, you are open to ask them in the chat, and address them. And somebody on the team, especially Dr. Melendez, will address your questions and comments. Dr. Melendez, Shaliana, Dr. Melendez, the forum is yours. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you, Dr. B, and thank you for your contributions in helping us put these sessions together and make them available to entrepreneurs and professionals and people that are trying to change the world through business and their profession. So jumping right in now, I'd like to share with you what we call the tree of bias. The tree of bias is really important for us to put into context how we are proposing to help you comprehend the different types of biases that you'll may be familiar with or that you will encounter as you work in your workplace with your colleagues, or even in student environments. I know we have some students here with us today. Generally, when we read or learn about biases, whether it's in the mainstream media or in a psychology class or something like that, we really focus on the manifestations of bias. And those manifestations, what I mean by that, are shown here on the tree. So we may hear things like confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency that we have as people to look for facts that support our viewpoints and dismiss facts that don't support our viewpoints. And so if we favor, say, a political candidate, and we read news articles that are disfavorable to that candidate, we may tend to dismiss those articles. Whereas if we read articles that are favorable to that candidate, we may tend to accept those as further confirmation of our beliefs. Gender bias is another example of a manifestation of bias, where we may tend to act differently, think differently, dependent upon the gender identification, as we identify the gender of someone that we are working with or considering, not only for employment, but potentially for an important job assignment. Certainly in the press and in the news, we've heard a great deal over the last month or two about racism. That's not explicitly here on the tree, but racism is another manifestation of bias, as is prejudice, implicit bias, self-serving bias, cognitive bias, overconfidence bias. And if we made the tree to scale, it would go way beyond the slide here, because there are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of different types of ways that bias manifests itself. And so a lot of the approaches that you see in terms of helping people understand how to deal with prejudice in the workplace or gender bias in the workplace, we view those as analogous to treating the symptoms, right, what we can observe, the manifestation, rather than really the root cause. And that's why at the bottom of this tree of biases, you see simply bias. Bias, as we'll learn today, is the tendency to do things or think about things automatically in a certain way, even though there's viable and sometimes better ways, if you will, of thinking about that very same thing. So we can think of biases as actually being neutral, but their manifestation, dependent upon the situation and how it affects other people, leading to the types of biases that begin to affect other people negatively, or limit opportunities of other people, or favor certain people over other people, as being the manifestations of those biases that we want to better understand. So to get to this point of understanding bias, we're going to be looking at some models today. And this is just a preview of one of the models that Shaliana Rolon will go into in more detail, but here I wanted to highlight two important points. And one is that if you look here on the lower left, we're representing the bias society of mind within your brain, if you will, within your mind, that really takes care of most of the things that happen in your daily life, whether they're trivial things like brushing your teeth, or more important things related to your business, perhaps in terms of identifying who you want to assign a key job role or who you want to hire. Now, initially, when you're very young, you don't really have a lot of concepts related to who would be good to have in a certain position in your company, or how you want to manage a certain situation. And there's a lot of learning that goes on, right? As a child, as an infant, through school, at home, maybe some of the early jobs or internships that you have. And in these processes, you experience events in certain environments that help you to form these biases that become you. Basically, they become a part of you. The second part is then after you've learned how to do certain things, when new events occur, your mind works to try to match up those events with something that's already in your tool set. So a bias, a tendency of doing things a certain way. And to the extent you believe that this new event and this new environment is similar enough to previous events, your consciousness may not even be aware of the fact that your mind takes care of how to respond to those events. And I'll give you a couple of examples and then pass it to Chaliana. The first example, very simplistically here, is to think about, if you can, remember how you learn to brush your teeth. So most of us tend to brush our teeth either with one hand or the other hand. Recognizing we're all individuals and there may be people here with us today that wake up one day and brush their teeth with the left hand, or brush their teeth with the right hand, and it's maybe somewhat random, but most people have a favored hand which they use to brush their teeth, and most people do brush their teeth. I recognize maybe not everybody does. And so early on, you may not really have had a preference in terms of how you did that, but now literally, if you brushed your teeth, twice a day, you've now brushed your teeth maybe 10,000 or 20,000 times, and it's very likely you don't think about that process at all. And so that's an example of a bias or a tendency that's fairly basic to understand, that maybe doesn't impact other people, right? Maybe it just impacts yourself, and maybe it doesn't really cause a problem for that. Another bias that you may develop over the course of your life, depending upon who you grew up with and who you spent time with, where you went to school, your family, what community you lived in. Another bias that's more complex, say, than the hand that you use to brush your teeth, is who you feel comfortable with. When someone walks into the room, whoever it is and whatever room it is, there's a likelihood that you feel more comfortable when someone walks into the room that has certain characteristics versus someone else that walks into the room that has other characteristics. Okay, and this may be something that you're just simply not conscious of, just like you probably don't spend a lot of time every day thinking about what hand you're going to use to brush your teeth. This comfortness, this bias that's associated with how you feel and how you think when people of certain characteristics are around, can in fact more clearly manifest itself in something that we saw in the tree of bias, right? If we're hiring someone or deciding who we want to work with on a project, we may tend to choose someone who we are more comfortable with, right? Especially if we know we're going to work a lot with this person, and we may tend to not choose someone who's very different than us because unknown to us, we don't have the same level of comfort. And so I know I've covered a lot of material in these 2 slides. Chaliana is going to go into depth into biases, and then over the next 2 days, we are going to understand how we can identify our biases. And then on the 3rd day, we're going to understand how we can manage them, modify them, and create new biases so that things that happen automatically are better aligned to the way that we want to be, or the things that we want to accomplish, whether it be personally, professionally, or in the businesses that we're a part of. So without further ado, my pleasure to pass it over to Chaliana.
Thank you, Dr. Melendez and Dr. Beatriz, for that great introduction. Now, hi everybody. Again, I'm Chaliana, and first off, I want to talk about what are biases. Now, before we get further into biases, I want you all to take a minute to think about what do biases mean to all of you. And so you can write it on a piece of paper, or you can think about it, write it on your phone, and in the end, this will make a little more sense, and we'll discuss our definitions of biases together. Now, I'm gonna start the minute now. Okay, that was a minute. And so the purpose of this exercise is to see if throughout the seminar, your definition of bias as you're exposed to this information that we're giving to you today changes over time, and see if you gain new concepts and understandings. And so, biases. Most of the time when we talk about biases, we do it in a negative light. We think about bias and think that someone who is biased is someone who might be labeled as bad, as a bad person. But today we will learn that biases dominate most of the things that we do throughout our day and our daily lives. And they are present in most of the decisions that we make in our professionals and individual lives. Now, biases. Biases are something that's being talked about on the news, on the media. A lot of information that we have accessible today is showing us that this is something that's being addressed by groups of people, like Dr. Melendez mentioned, that's happening right now in the United States, where racism is a subject that's bringing on riots and controversial subjects. And so we are talking about gender bias, pregnancy bias in the military, racial bias in algorithms, in the pages that we use today in social media, and many more. And different companies are developing strategies to address these subjects in their own organizations, just like Dr. Melendez mentioned. But we want to take a step back into this definition of bias and use a whole entire new definition throughout our seminar. This will be that bias is a tendency to think or behave in a certain way, even when there are other alternatives. What does this mean? Well, bias can manifest itself in a straightforward, non-complex examples. Let's say like brushing our teeth with the same hand every morning, like Dr. Melendez mentioned. We do this naturally. It comes to us without any thought. We just do it, just like walking or eating. They are behaviors that we just don't get much thought to them. For another example, we have taking the same route to work every morning. We get into our cars, go to work, go to school, and do our errands in the same route maybe, and we don't really think about all the other routes and streets that we can take to go to the same place. Now, biases can become complex. These can be gesture bias. For example, when we talk, we use our body to communicate many of the things that we want to say together with our words. Maybe I can do a hand gesture or use my face in a way that communicates that I'm experiencing an emotion. And sometimes these gestures can be offensive, maybe, or misinterpreted by the other person whom I'm communicating with. Another example can be gender bias in a professional environment. Let's say there's an interviewer who always favors male applicants in his interviews. He has both female and male applicants, all with different backgrounds each time he has to do an interview. They all have different preparations. However, the scenario that they have to hire somebody is always the same. And when the process is in place, the interviewer always favors the male applicants on performance. And we think about, okay, then how is this tendency or this behavior developed? We have to think about this person's past experiences. Our past experiences reinforce all these behaviors in a certain way. Maybe the interviewer has been interviewing for over 25 years, and maybe his experience is that male applicants tend to perform better. However, maybe this gives them a default answer and a default way of managing the situation where there are other alternatives, excuse me. These are the female applicants. The female applicants may have become better prepared in this scenario, but since our interviewer is biased that male applicants always perform better, he chooses that default behavior of favoring the male applicants. Now, we want to take a step back into the way that we think about bias and see it in the most simple or maybe trivial behaviors that we have every day. That's what we want you to think about. For example, can you see bias in this image? If you look at it from a first glance, you think that, hey, this is trivial. This is something that doesn't have anything to do with bias. But as you can see, there are 3 dogs, and the 3 dogs were picked and given a treat by some individual. The first dog got a treat, the one in the middle and the one in the right. And so this brings the idea that everyone has different perspectives of looking at things. There was a reason why somebody picked the one in the middle and not the one on the right or the left, and vice versa. Another good example to demonstrate this is this example of a side of the bed. When we have a bed and we share it with someone, we tend to pick a side and we don't really give much thought to it, just as the dogs. Some may favor a left side, some may favor the right side, and so on. And this is further explained with this other example. When we prepare ourselves and get ready, we have sometimes multiple choices of outfits that we can make. And sometimes we pick a particular shirt over another and vice versa. And this is to demonstrate that our biases dominate everything that we do, even if it's the most simple and mundane things that we do every day, just as getting ready for work and dressing up with a particular shirt, just as favoring a dog or favoring a particular side of the bed. And that is okay. It may seem scary to think that biases do dominate everything that we do, but it helps us to do the things that we do in the most efficient way. It's a system that our brain has to receive this information and handle it in the most efficient way possible in order for us to be able to think about other things. And so, what does this all mean? What does this all mean about everyone having different perspectives and facing different scenarios and favoring different alternatives over others? It means that we're all biased and we each have our own way of thinking about things. This is what we call our individual bias. And now, each of us has our own bias, our individual bias that may become complex when we experience different events in environments and when we interact with other people. Our biases may become overconfidence bias, prejudice, and gender bias because we are exposed to different events and scenarios throughout our lives that sometimes we refer to as life-changing moments or life-changing events, like going from preschool to school and going to high school or going to college, or meeting people that impact us in our lives, or simple things as just having a conversation with a friend or a stranger. These are things that use our concepts and our understandings and impacts them in a way that sometimes may seem like they don't. Now, to further explain these concepts, we are going to look at the pre-seminar survey. To prepare for the seminar, we distributed a survey where we got to know some of our biases. These biases were described in a simple way, and people would give an opinion about their own experience with that behavior that was explained. And also, they were giving some concepts and some visual input, and they were supposed to answer based on their own experience. Now, let's look at those results and see what we can get from them. Now, in the first part of the survey, we described the behavior, and the participants would agree or disagree in a scale from 1 to 5, whether they agreed with what was being said. The first example is, to excel at my work, I need to drink coffee first. Now, you see that 9 individuals disagreed with this prompt. They don't need to drink coffee to excel at their work, while there are 11 people that agree that they do need to drink coffee in order to excel at the work. Now, why is this important? First off, we need to see the variability in this context. We're talking about work, and people, to be excellent, to feel like they can perform better, they need to drink coffee first, while there are others who don't. This shows us variability, that individual bias manifesting itself. Another good example is this next one. When it comes to work or errands, I am an early bird. We see a variability in the results. Again, people who disagree and others who don't. So some people may think that being an early bird is something that's bad. You may label this person who prefers to not be an early bird as lazy. And so we ask ourselves, is it really important to know these things? Now, I'm gonna do a poll, and I'm going to ask you guys, do you think it should matter to an employer if their employees prefer early or later working hours? I'm gonna give you a minute for you to answer that. Okay, that was a minute. And so let's look at the results real quick. Okay, now the results will come in later, but going back to the example, when I talk about this variability and, oh, there they are. Okay, so it's kind of, you got 54% say yes and 46% individuals say no. Now, why does this matter? Why does this variability of disagreeing with something or agreeing with some other thing matters in this context? Well, when we talk about biases, we need to take environment and how we relate to it as individuals. And so we have people that may prefer early working hours because they know that in the morning that they will perform better. And we have other people who feel like being early doesn't matter, that they prefer to work in later hours. And so being an employer maybe by knowing this information, you might be able to create an environment where there are flexible working hours for your employees. And so you will boost up their performance and their comfort in order to work with those biases in their favor. So this is a great example to think about. Maybe it seems trivial, but maybe it might boost up the confidence and the success of your own company by knowing these things. Another good example to show that how individual biases manifest itself is this one. Great outcomes in projects, tasks, or assignments don't depend on luck. We see that 6 individuals totally agreed, while there are 2 others that totally disagree. And so this is the outlook of individuals who feel this way. And this is something that should be taken into account when understanding that bias is individual. Now, another example, and the last example in this aspect is this one. A messy work area doesn't distract me from my work. Again, variability in the results. Some people totally disagree, while others agree completely. I personally can't have a messy work area because I won't be able to perform well. I will be really distracted and I will probably spend large amounts of time fixing that mess. As well as if I don't have a messy area, but the person on my right or my left, a colleague has a messy work area, that will also distract me as well. So I might have to let them know that, hey, your area is messy, it's bothering me. Now, the following examples present the participant with an image and a concept. It is different from this particular exercise where we just present a behavior description. Now we're going to present a concept and an image, and we'll see how each individual, based on their own experience with the concept and the visual input from the images, affects the way that they answer and demonstrates their individual bias. The first example is, which of the foods is the healthiest? The concept in this case is the word healthy. And the visual inputs are these 4 meals, each fairly different from each other. As you can see that the concept of healthy is different for each of the participants. We have 25 responses, and some people answered that the salad, letter C, was healthiest, while there are others who prefer the burrito or the pasta or the burger. And so we think, wow, what does healthy mean to all these people compared to mine, right? It's really different. For some people, healthy might mean that salad, while there are others who think that it's the pasta. On the right of this example, I have provided the caloric totals of each of the meals. And this adds more variability to the context of this question. We have foods, and now we have information on the caloric totals. And so some people's concept of healthy might come from knowing this information, knowing what's behind just an image, knowing what's behind the nutrients and the things that that meal contains that might affect their concept of what healthy is. And there's also something that we need to note is that people may have health issues. They might be going through a specific diet that requires them to eat specific types of nutrients and foods. And again, everyone has different nutritional needs. Some people might be counting their calories in order to achieve some goal or just to take care of themselves and so on. This shows us variability. And now we're going to see how by presenting the same image with a different concept, these answers change completely. That is, which of the foods is most filling? Now, the word filling changes completely the answers of the participants. Now, the concept of healthy is different from filling because based on their own experiences with these foods, they were maybe more filled by the burger or by the pasta, even though they might have thought that another of the foods is healthier. And so this is just to present that knowing this information, we note that there are individual ways of thinking about things. And so I present again the caloric intake, the caloric totals of each of the foods, because by knowing this information, we might be able to transform these concepts that we already know. So maybe instead of thinking that one of the foods is most filling. By knowing this other information, I might be able to try something else, try another alternative, just as our definition of bias states. I change my default answer that might have been the pasta to the burrito and something like that. Now, the next example follows a similar structure where we put the concept of which of the foods is most expensive. Again, we're presented with the concept of expensive and the visual input is still the same. However, we have a different set of information that is the cost of each of the meals. And so knowing this information might change the way that we think of the foods, because somehow maybe somebody thought that the salad was more expensive, but then they see the cost, and maybe my concept of expensive might be $5. I might think like, hey, $5 is expensive enough. $12, I can't imagine. And just like that, the concept of expensive affected each of these individuals' answers and the way that they saw things. And now they might be able to transform the concept of expensive by being exposed to this information. Now, what are we talking about here? We're talking about self-awareness. When we choose our default answer, we don't really give much thought to things, but being exposed to information relating to that context, that decision or that choice that we're making might be able to create self-awareness in us. And hey, maybe thinking that expensive might be today $6 or $5 the next. And so these are things to think about, and we'll see why they become important and how they can transform our biases. Now, the next example follows a similar pattern. Now we present 4 dogs and we talk about the concept of friendly. The question asked, which dog is more friendly than the rest? The concept of friendly might be, again, different for each of the participants, and maybe they were influenced by their own experience with dogs. Most of us, maybe, I know I have had dogs since early in my childhood, while I know people that have never had dogs, and they grew up with cats or they never had a pet. And so based on our own experience, we made a choice. Now, this choice can become controversial for this concept of friendly dogs, because on the right side, you see a set of scores on the temper of each of these dogs. These are based on the American Temperaments Test Society, where they test dogs' behaviors and their way that they respond to stimuli on a controlled environment. And the dogs are reduced to a number and a breed. For example, the Chihuahua breed scored a 69.6%, and the sample size was 46. And the same pattern occurs with each of the dog breeds. But what's important for us here is how we can make assumptions on a group of individuals that have had a different set of experiences based on a standardized test, when each of these dogs might have had their own individual experiences in a different environment. For example, let's say that the pit bull that we see in this image had been part of a family where they grew up with kids and it was a caring and loving environment. Well, there might be other dogs in that sample size that might have been through an abusive environment, or maybe they were abandoned and adopted and things like that. They go through different experiences that affect their temper and the way that they behave. And so these create controversial biases, such as making assumptions that a dog breed is dangerous just because of the experience of some. And this brings us the question, like, how can we make these assumptions? How are these concepts made? How do we jump into these default answers just by looking at something and being exposed to a set of information? To further understand this, we're going to discuss the gaining perspective over time model. Now, the gaining perspective over time model is a framework that we use to understand our biases, specifically how we create them and how we learn over time, and how these are updated as we are exposed to more and more variables in that environment. We're gonna look at a simple model And then we're going to go further into each of the components. So I'm going to turn on the pointer so you can see where I'm at. This version of the model explains how there is an environment and there are events in that environment. Events can be a conversation with someone, brushing our teeth, being exposed to information, like I mentioned before. And that event carries that information through outputs. The outputs reach us, the individual who's in that environment, and we process that information in order to make an understanding of what is happening. Now, what do we use to make those alternatives, those understanding, those things that we might think might be happening in that event? We use our biases. Those things that we have reinforced over time, those concepts and things that we learned that have helped us create our personalities and the way that we interpret the world to create alternatives based on the information that we receive from that event. And so those alternatives that are our biases and the way that we make meaning are sent to that event. And the event sometimes sends us and let us know information that might help us understand if we had made the correct understanding of what's happening in that event. And that information is passed on through prediction errors. Sometimes when we're having a conversation with somebody, we think that they were angry at us. And so our alternative might have been, you're angry with me. And that's how we respond to them. But they let us know that, no, I'm not angry at you. And so we made a prediction error. And when the persons let us know that they weren't angry with us, we update our bias and our understanding of what was happening changes. So maybe when these characteristics are present in a similar context, a similar event, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person is angry. And so we are going to use this bias throughout our lives over time, applying it to the events that happen and send us information. And we use our biases to decode that information and to respond to it. Now, by updating that bias, I have a whole new set of biases. That updated version of the bias will be used to decode, like I said, those events. Now, we're going to look at different components in the model in order to further understand what all of this means. Okay, the first thing that we're going to talk about is the events. The events are created by us or the environment, and they communicate information. And this information might be physical or emotional. And it is most of the times an interaction from the individual with that information, because it needs to be decoded and understood by the individual in order to create those alternatives and use our biases. Now, how do we interpret that information that the event is sending to us? It comes in the forms of outputs, and we use a set of tools that are our biases. These are called our concepts and our agents. Now, our concepts are our understanding of something. We create concepts throughout our lives as we are exposed, like we mentioned in the beginning, to people, environment, and events. A concept can be the concept of family, the concept of work, the concept of friends. My concept of friends and family might not be the same as another person's or colleague's concept of family and friends. And so each of us give our own understanding built on our past experiences. These also carry emotional meaning. There might be an emotion when it comes to my own understanding of what family is and what friends make me feel, and so on. The other tool are our agents. These are processes in our bodies that go together with our concepts. This can be walking, moving our hands, a specific gesture that we use with our friends, or the way that we move our heads and things like that. And these work together to make use of those abilities, physical responses, and so on. These together form our biases. This will be used to respond to that event. Now, combinations of concepts and agents are used in our brains in order to respond to those events, and these are called our mental models. Now, together, our mental models, we have many to interpret all of the information that we're exposed to, form what is called our society of mind. This is what Dr. Melendez mentioned in the beginning. And together, they form our biases. And we use this information to process that event, right? And these were built based on our experiences, our past experiences. So the society of mind of Shaliana is not going to be the same society of mind as Dr. Melendez or Dr. Beatriz. So throughout all the information that we're receiving and we are going to use to process that event, something needs to intervene, right? In order to make those predictions and create the understanding that we're giving to that event. That is done in our control network. Our control network gathers the necessary information that event is giving to us in order to create alternatives and understanding. It is the overseer of interactions between me as an individual and that event that's happening in front of me. The first thing that our control network does is the process of categorization. Categorization analyzes characteristics of that event, those characteristics that we can relate to our concepts, right? Because we're exposed to an event, that event may carry similar characteristics to another event that we have experienced in our past. And so in that way, we are able to use our concepts. And this is a constant process. We are constantly interacting with that environment, trying to understand all of that is given to us in that moment. And so, yes, we use that to create those alternatives. And these are called predictions in the model. Now, each of these predictions come with our biases. These are a default answer to a way to respond to that event. And so each of these predictions carry accuracies. Each accuracy is affected by something really important, which is called our emotional granularity. Because other than making an understanding of something, we also give an emotional meaning to what's happening around us. And so with our emotional granularity, we are capable of understanding and identifying an emotion in a context, in an event. So the emotional granularity is that capacity that we have to predict an emotion. In the model, that emotional granularity affects the accuracy of each of our predictions, because if we haven't been exposed to a particular emotion throughout our lives, we might not be able to understand when it is happening and manifesting itself in an event. Now, something else that affects these predictions is the interoceptive network. The interoceptive network comes together with our emotional response, but this time these are physical and internal responses to that event. The interoceptive network predicts and tracks changes in our organs, because sometimes when we're going through a certain experience, our heart might race or our stomach might churn or tingle depending on what we're exposed to. And the interoceptive network does this by regulating our body budget. What is our body budget? Our body budget is our energy resource, and the energy resource in our body that we use to do every single process that's inside of us. We use energy to think, we use energy to talk, to move ourselves, and to do all of those processes that happen inside of us. So our body budget is distributed to our organs in order to respond to that event. So there will be sometimes situations where, let's say someone is sad. If someone is sad, I might feel empathy for what they're going through, and I might feel like a pang in my chest or a knot in my throat. These are sensations that relate to this event, and these are my responses to that event, and these are regulated by my body budget and in the interoceptive network. The interoceptive network works together with the control network in order to give that physical response and that emotional response and the meaning that I give to it. That's why we see this arrow over here. Now, those predictions carry the emotional meaning and that physical response here. And these are sent to that event. And I mentioned before that sometimes we are able to see if that prediction that we made, that understanding that we give to the event is what we expected or not. That comes in the form as a prediction result. Sometimes when we notice that our prediction wasn't correct, we process these as prediction errors. These prediction errors are sent to our society of mind, to our mental models, and we are able to update them to see like, hey, whenever I am presented with a similar situation related to this event or similar to it, I may not respond the same way as I did before because I've noticed that there was a prediction error. For example, let's say that we see somebody who looks down, somebody who looks like something might have happened, that they seem a little sad. Sad might be my bias way of thinking of their behavior. But if I give it a little bit more thought, maybe they might be grieving. This might be another alternative. Maybe they might be mourning or feeling depressed. These might be another prediction. So between sad, grieving, or being depressed, I have an accuracy that accompanies each of those alternatives. And those are affected by my emotional granularity. Maybe I've never been with someone who's mourning, so I wouldn't be able to really gauge whether or not this person might be mourning or not. And so I just respond with my default alternative that they are sad. And maybe they weren't being sad, like I mentioned before. So this comes as a prediction result. And they were actually bummed that they had gone through a test and didn't do quite well. And that is received as a prediction error. So this helps me update my mental models of when someone looks sad or depressed or bummed down, and maybe I am able to further understand whether or not this situation is happening. So right now I've updated my mental model, and this is shown here in the model, this mirrored image. This is me, the individual, but with an updated way of thinking about things. And when I am presented with a similar event, I might be able to further gauge that this person is actually not going through depression and things like that. I might be able to understand other alternatives. Now, this is happening through time. And so at first I made a default response, but when I updated my mental models, I was able to respond differently to that same event. Now, another example of how we update our mental models over time is Dr. Melendez's example of brushing our teeth. So when we're children, our parents teach us to walk, how to eat, how to go to the bathroom, how to brush our teeth. And we have learned throughout our lives maybe to use a particular hand. We have created that bias because it's comfortable for us. It's okay, it's efficient. Why would I need to use the other one when one works good for me, right? But events happen. Something might happen that we might have to use the other hand, or maybe just because you want to make it a challenge and try it yourself. And so this is when we notice how important the interoceptive network and our body budget is, because our body budget is being regulated in order for us to work with that particular hand that makes us feel comfortable when we brush our teeth. Now, when we try to use our other hand, our event, that information and our body budget might be telling us, this is uncomfortable for me, this is really hard. I have to exert much more energy because we are updating our mental models. It's gonna be difficult at first, but over time, maybe we are able to use our other hand to brush our teeth, and our body budget will regulate itself back to that feeling of comfort, of doing it effortlessly. But at first, it might become difficult. Now, this is a trivial example, like we mentioned before, but let's talk about that example of the interviewer that favors male applicants. So what can our interviewer do in order to update their mental model of what a good performance is and what to do when presented with that event of hiring someone? Maybe they weren't able to gauge that there was a prediction error in what they were doing in the process. Maybe they can bring some other perspective in. Another perspective sometimes brings a whole new set of biases, a whole new way of looking at things, a whole new set of alternatives that we can use in order to catch ourselves in those prediction errors. We're creating self-awareness. So our interviewer brings another person in that adds variability, and this person can tell our interviewer that, hey, your process isn't just because you're favoring male applicants. So we're going to make this a little bit more open. We are going to be, there's going to be the two of us, and together we will see how each of us creates alternatives of this event. I've noticed maybe in a certain process that a female applicant performed better and they had this X and Y characteristics to them that may favor what we are looking for in this position. So in this context, the interviewer who favored male applicants was brought this whole new perspective, which let him know that his process wasn't being just. And he was able to see that there was a prediction error in his process, but this took time. Since this was a behavior that was being reinforced because he had years of experience working in this company or organization, this was a behavior that was going to be difficult to see that it wasn't okay. And so they had to regulate their body budget. And at first, it might have felt uncomfortable, and maybe it might have felt like they had to exert much more energy and efforts in order to change it. But by bringing another perspective, they were able to see that there was a prediction error, and maybe they could change the process and better themselves and their mental models by bringing this whole new perspective. And so this is a way where we can create self-awareness and use this tool of knowing how we learn and how we create biases, how we can apply this in a context where maybe we're not able to catch ourselves, maybe we're not able to change these biases or really see that they are present. So by using the model and by understanding and talking to others and looking for help and bringing other perspectives, we were able to catch ourselves like that. And so now, to talk about these concepts and what we have presented to you today, I'm going to leave you to with Dr. Melendez to have a proper discussion. And so that definition of bias that you might have written or thought about in the beginning, I want you to ask yourselves if your definition of bias has changed, and if so, how? Let us know, and we're gonna make a poll and we're gonna give you a minute to answer it. Okay, and it's been a minute now. So now I'm gonna leave you with Dr. Melendez, and yes, the results are in. Awesome to see that the information has changed your definition of bias. I'm happy to hear that. Now, if you have any questions, we're going to address them, and Dr. Melendez is going to touch on some topics and important aspects of the presentation. I leave you with Dr. Melendez now.
Thank you, Charliana. So before I'm going to introduce here some discussion points, and then we will open it up for anybody who wants to either put a question in the chat or turn on their microphone or turn on their microphone and their camera. Reminder, we are being recorded. So first I wanted to make the point that the model, the gaining perspective model, is meant to model as best we understand how we develop biases, how we apply biases, and what's important in terms of making adjustments to those biases based on how what we think is going to happen is different than what does happen. One of the comments in the chat related to whether or not the feedback is viably always there, and that's really one of the biggest, I think, highlights one of the biggest issues in dealing with these different manifestations of bias: gender bias, confirmation bias, discrimination, prejudice. Is oftentimes we don't get that feedback. So we may say things in a certain way that we've always said them, and not realize that for a particular individual in the room or a group of individuals in the room, that the way that we've always said it is something that they interpret to be offensive, or they interpret as being demeaning or influences them in some other way, right? And so in those scenarios, how likely is it that that group of people or a person will give you feedback, right? So here's a learning point for your business environment is once you understand that biases are with you from the moment you wake up, the first leg that you use to get out of bed, what's the first foot you put on the floor? Is it the left or the right? My guess is you'll find that usually it's the same foot. To brushing your teeth, to the way that you drive to work, to your impressions when you get in the office as to who's there, who's not there, who's late, or who's comes in later in the day. All of those types of things happen without us being mindful of them, without us recognizing that they're happening. And that's fantastic. That's what we want to have happen. But what we don't want to have happen is an open loop process where when those biases aren't in line with our own values and our own goals, or are negatively affecting other people who we don't want to negatively affect, how do we get that feedback? And so in that scenario, it makes sense, certain things that you hear where supervisors have an open door policy, or there's a policy where the employee can talk to the supervisor of a supervisor without having to talk to the supervisor, right? Why is that important? That's important so that so that you can encourage your employees or your team when they observe feelings that they have, or they observe something in the environment that they believe the behavior of a person is impacting negatively the behavior of the other person or the team, they have the opportunity to give that feedback, right? And that happens when you acknowledge up front in your organization that biases are okay, that we have all biases, that all of us have biases. And while some of the biases are common, the collective set of biases is very different. The gaining perspective model shows you that we establish these biases throughout the course of our lifetime in the environments that we're in with the feedback that we get, right? Sometimes if we say something off and someone's in front of us and they give an expression like, what did you say? It gives us immediate feedback that we can choose to make use of or ignore. But either way, it gives us feedback that we can use to make adjustments. The situation that you want to put processes in place in your work environment or in your personal environment is to create an environment where when things that you do or when things that other people do cause some unintended influence on someone else, that they have the opportunity to give you feedback or give someone feedback, either openly or in private, and you want to encourage that within your organization so that these biases don't manifest themselves in a way that systemically affect your organization. Some discussion points here from our talk today. We form these biases throughout our lifetime. Our collective set of biases largely determines our performance. What does that mean? That means that
I think that at this moment we have like a little cutout in the communication. Okay, there we go again, Dr. Melendez.
Thank you. So our collective set of biases largely determines our performance, whether we know it or not. And so what you're going to learn in the next session is, well, how do I identify my bias sets, right? Some of them are fairly obvious. You can think about, well, what hand do I use to brush my teeth? What side of the bed do I sleep on? If I've got 50 articles of clothing in my closet, you can go look in that closet and say, hey, you know, are there articles of clothing in this closet that I haven't used for the last year? And are there articles of clothing that tend to end up in my laundry basket every week, right? So some of these things are easier to identify, and they may or may not influence, you know, what happens in your profession or in your job. Those examples likely don't, but they could, right? If you have 50 articles of clothing and always use the same shirt, people are going to notice that in your work environment. And that may cause them, based on their biases, to come to some conclusions about you in terms of, you know, why. They're going to make some association perhaps as to why you always wear the same clothes. Maybe they may assume that you don't really have a lot of other clothes to choose from, right? So getting to know your biases is a full-time job, but thankfully in day 2, we're going to teach 2 different approaches that you can use on a regular basis to start to identify your biases. One of the nice things about identifying your biases is as you get comfortable and get used to identifying your biases on a regular basis, you'll begin to actually identify other people's biases. And identifying other people's biases can help you help that person. For example, if they're an employee or someone on your team and you recognize what you think is a bias, it allows you to have a conversation with that person and maybe help them identify biases that they may not realize that they have. Misapplied biases may lead to injustices. And this is what we talked about at the very beginning in terms of the tree of bias. And that is that, you know, our biases are learned and then they're reinforced and reinforced and reinforced in certain environments and events. And it's really when the environment and the event and the people you're around is significantly different in some way from the environment in which your biases develop that you have an opportunity for a prediction error. And what we don't know is in that situation, if it's a significant prediction error, what's going to happen? You know, is there going to be conflict, or is the other person just going to stay quiet and leave the situation? Or is there going to be an opportunity to bring that, those feelings, those observations up? And what you want to do in your work environment or in your personal environment is create the opportunity to have that common understanding and that promote that dialogue. And that's what we'll learn about in day 3. So let me see if there are any other questions or comments, or if anyone would like to make a comment live or a question. I'll give a few moments to see if anybody chimes in. Right. Yes, Francisco, please do.
Okay, hello everyone. So one of the biases that I have been working with recently is the one I call the common sense, because as an entrepreneur, that really affects me, because I was like, well, if you do this, you have to do this, and this is common sense. And since biases come with experience with each different of ourselves, of us as people, as persons, that doesn't happen. And I get frustrated, and I even asked to a human resource consultant to see about this, and he explained, he even write a book about it called Common Sense Doesn't Exist. And I read it, and I was like, whoa, I have a lot of biases in work that I don't even have, that I didn't even notice about. And common sense is one that really affects entrepreneurs, because I have been talking to other entrepreneurs, and that's a theme that we don't talk about. And we don't get, like, when we're working with people, we don't like get that bias, or we don't notice that bias. So this thing about biases, it goes a long way of affecting like work, teamwork, and everything else in your life. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Very, very insightful. You know, obviously, if you look at the gaining perspective model and what we talked about today, it's very consistent with the observation of the person you talk to, which is that the only thing about common sense that's common is that everything's different, right? So, this comes about from a tendency that that most people have to try to simplify things, right? And if you go back to the dog example, Gabrielle had some excellent observations there about the way the question was asked, and Chaliana made some observations about the fact that you know, that some of the facts that were presented from this survey of the dogs basically lumped, you know, hundreds of dogs together in one number, and said that, you know, they're 74% you know, friendly. When the reality is that, you know, if you've been around dogs, we have some similarities in terms of people, right? Some dogs are same breed. Some dogs are more friendly than other dogs, and some dogs may be more friendly to certain people than they are to other people, right? You don't want a guard dog necessarily to be friendly to everybody. You want a guard dog to be friendly to you, perhaps, and your family and friends, but not necessarily someone who's coming to do you harm. And so, you know, when you look at that idea and the concept of common sense, and you try to reconcile it with the diversity that we are as humans, where every single person is unique, right? We may have the same parts, we may all have brains and hearts and bodies, but our minds are a function of the experiences that we've had for our lifetime. So that the idea that there's something that's common sense, sadly, is maybe a romantic idea, but in reality, I would suggest to you as an entrepreneur that you do better oftentimes when you're trying to resolve problems when you consider individuals, Now, there are times where it makes sense not to consider the individuals, right? And there, you know, there's a lot of marketing strategies where you get a lot of data and you have a lot of statistics, and you can begin to use biases as an advantage, right? Because you want to identify groups of individuals or characteristics of groups of individuals that are more likely to buy your product than other individuals, right? And so your natural tendency to promote your business may cause you to write advertisements in a way that really are more attractive to, you know, single white females between the age of 20 and 25 than they are to, you know, older Hispanic gentlemen that are, you know, 80 years old, right? And so bias is something that is extremely pervasive, and businesses use it to make their marketing strategies more effective and to grow their businesses. And so that's why it's important to, you know, we think to get down to the root of bias, and then in the gaining perspective model, understand that it's ultimately all about individuals. And if you're serious about addressing the various manifestations of bias in the workplace, you can demonstrate yourself that serious
technical difficulty again. Melendez have been cut. Okay, he's back. He's back. And also Antonio have a comment. Yes.
Can I? Hello?
Hello, yes, you may.
Can you hear me? Bueno, buenos días. Good morning to all. Well, I guess it's a thought because I'm understanding how bias is.
So we're here.
Hello? Can you?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. It's practically understanding also as I listen and kind of reading the discussion points on applying biases and how it may lead to injustices, right? I think I don't want to comment or kind of like jump the gun and just go ahead or fast forward, but I'm also want to understand how biases, like, does it discern on us, on ourselves, where we self-sabotage ourselves based on biases? Because I heard Francisco mention about as entrepreneurs, we go and we navigate different waters, and we usually judge ourselves and put lots of pressure on ourselves, which are, I think, our own biases. And sometimes we're the first ones to, I guess, feel that before we apply it. I don't know if I'm correct in saying that, but I also see it as how it hurts me before I even hurt others. So it's kind of worked with myself. I just wanted to share that because I think it's something that I've been dealing with. You have different biases on age, on whether you are good enough, understanding challenges and obstacles. So I think all these have a certain impact when it comes to biases, and so I just wanted to share that, especially with I guess some as entrepreneurs and understanding more of ourselves as we can move forward.
Thank you, Antonio. Absolutely, and you may have heard the phrase, we are our own worst enemies. And I think you can see that. I'll try to give you some simplistic examples, and we'll get into more sophisticated examples over the next couple of days. But there's two levels really to your question. The first one is that, and we'll see this in the next class, that because the biases generally work in your subconsciousness and they generally work automatically, that's a great thing because it allows your consciousness to think about hard problems, right? If your consciousness was thinking about walking and how to brush your teeth, you know, or how to sit up in your chair, it wouldn't give your consciousness much time to think about, well, how, you know, how do I solve this issue, or what product should I create, or how do I get this in front of my customers, right? So you want this set of biases, and you want them working for you. What we are trying to, if you take away one lesson or two lessons here today and over the next few days, is whether you like it or not, these biases are working on your behalf or not, right? So you can choose to turn a blind eye to it, and you're going to live your life just like you always have, right? And it's going to be fantastic. It's, you know, it's not a matter of that, but you can, or you can understand how they work, how to engage with them with your consciousness, and work with strategies to adjust those biases so that they don't hurt you, so that they're not your worst enemy, right? So, so you're not getting in front of yourself. And I'll leave you with this thought before I pass it back to Charliana for any last comments before Dr. B. Your biases, you need to, or people need to consciously, if they want to optimize their performance, they need to consciously understand what they are and actively work to mitigate them. If you have a bias, if you feel you have a bias to overeat cookies, a simple strategy is to not have cookies accessible in your workplace, right? Or in your kitchen cupboard, right? You leave the cookies in the grocery store, or you leave the cookies when someone comes into the office and say, hey, I baked everybody some cookies, right? And say, okay, I'm gonna eat cookies today because I wanna promote my work environment, right? But the fact that you need to do that, you know, to use tactics to try to get your own self to not do certain things in that example means that your consciousness is not really fully in control, right? Your biases are, and the influences of those biases in the world are really determining a lot of what you do. They're determining a lot of how you respond when you're negotiating with a vendor or with a lending institution or with an investor, right? Now, here's the thing. A lot of people already understand these concepts, and they have gotten good at knowing other people's biases. So when you walk into a room and you're negotiating a business deal, right? Imagine that the other person, you know, imagine that you, and I'm not picking on you, but imagine you go in and you're not aware of your biases, but the other person is intimately aware of how biases work, right? And they are able to assess quickly how you work, right? So you can imagine that in this situation, you're really at a disadvantage, right? So it's not so much, it's not only that if you're not aware of your biases, you can't it'll be difficult for you to maximize your performance because these biases aren't working for you. But it's also that if you're not aware of these biases, you're susceptible basically to other people using your own biases to influence you in certain ways, right? If they know that you have a bias that you like to avoid conflict, right? And you're in a negotiation, that other person may simply say, hey, Antonio, why are you being so combative here? I thought we were friends, right? And all of a sudden now you're, what do I do? I don't want conflict, right? But they may be very well intentionally or unintentionally. In other words, they may know they're doing this or they may not be leveraging this bias that they've identified in you to put you at a disadvantage. So thank you, everyone. A few closing comments. I'm going to transition back here to Charliana for any words, and then she'll transition back to Dr. B.
Hi, everyone. Hi again. So my highlights to conclude the seminar are basically that this shouldn't be scary to us, embracing our biases. I think that being self-aware that they are there and being aware that they dominate most of the things that we do, to the most trivial things and to the things that come natural to us. It's something that might be beneficial for us, because by being self-aware and understanding what we saw in the gaining perspective model, we can say like, hey, I can train myself. I can maybe update my mental models through help from other people, through reinforcing other behaviors. And so that's self-awareness. It's a first step into understanding yourself and your biases. And that's why I encourage you all to come to day 2 and day 3 of our mini series, because you'll be able to see tools that help you identify your biases and tools that will help you change and update those biases that may not work for you in the way that you would want to. Yes, and I hope that this was helpful, and you can ask more questions in our upcoming in our upcoming seminars. And yeah, it was a pleasure to be here with all of you. And now I'm gonna leave you with Dr. Beatriz, who's gonna give some ending remarks.
Thank you, Chaliana. Thank you, Dr. Melendez. Thank you to everybody for your questions, comments, and I can see that you are looking forward for tomorrow. I saw some questions and the analysis of Chaliana model that she had been developing and working for a little bit. I can tell for a while. Seeing you tomorrow is going to be a pleasure. Don't forget to have your notes with you so we can you can compare and keep building strategies, definitions, models that tomorrow Velez is going to be with us with Dr. Melendez. But also I would encourage you to, when you see the evaluation form, don't forget to fill it out at the end of the presentation. And looking forward to we continue in session 2 of our 3 days of Bias for Business seminar. Have a great and wonderful day and keep in touch. Just an email away.